So welcome to Chapter 11, the physical and chemical control of microbes. And let me ask you this question. What if you didn't shower or take a bath in over a year? How would that change your normal microbiome? Or would it change it at all? And would you have any problems with social distancing at that point? Or maybe you're like this and have the cat that just simply says no need to shower. I bathed you while you slept. Even though I don't know how you'd sleep through a cat bath. So how do we control microorganisms? Because this is a problem in our medical fields. Historically, microbial control methods were varied. One was the salting or smoking of food. Salting food created that high external osmotic situation that did not allow microbes to actually grow. Smoking food did basically kind of the same way, other than the fact too it also drew out moisture. And so moisture is necessary for bacterial growth as well, and so drying of the food actually dissuaded the spoilage bacteria as well. Pickling food, putting it in a very acidic environment, since most of our pathogenic organisms are neutrophiles. They don't like to be in that high acidic environment. Drying food, exposing food, clothing, or bedding to sunlight. And this was simply to use ultraviolet light to damage the DNA of the microbes. Burning clothing or corpses. This was the ultimate form of sterilization in the fact that it caused incineration. Storing water in copper or silver containers, as we do know that some of the heavy metals actually have antimicrobial properties. So 4 possible outcomes of microbial control outside of the body. We can see sterilization, disinfection, antisepsis, and decontamination, and I'll explain the difference between these. Sterilization is the destruction of all microbial life, and really we should say the destruction of all potential pathogenic microbial life. Disinfection destroys most microbial life, reducing contamination on inanimate or non-living surfaces. Antisepsis, also called degermination, is the same as disinfection, but this is done on a living surface, such as the skin. Decontamination, also called sanitation, is the mechanical removal of most microbes from an animate or inanimate surface. Decontamination simply is decreasing the number of potential pathogenic microorganisms on a surface. So we can actually look at this chart and see the different varieties of microbial control methods. We have our physical agents, our chemical agents, and then mechanical removal methods. In the physical agents, we have both dry and moist heat, and we'll talk about both. And we have radiation, both ionizing and non-ionizing. In the chemical agents, we have gases and liquids. We could put solids in here, but most solid chemical agents that are antimicrobial will be dissolved in some sort of solvent, so it would actually be a liquid. And then mechanical removal methods, such as air or liquid filtration, is also going to be one of these methods of control. The primary target of microbial control is those microorganisms that are capable of causing infection and or spoilage of foodstuff. These microbes are constantly present in the external environment and even on the human body. Often it contains a mixture of these pathogenic microbes. Now, when we look at the relative resistance to microbial control of microbial forms, the absolute most resistant form of a pathogen is going to be the prions. The only thing that gets rid of prions is incineration. The next lower is going to be the bacterial endospores, which makes sense in the fact that the endospores are formed in order to survive hostile environments. And then the acid-fast bacteria, Staphylococcus and Pseudomonas, protozoan cysts, then the protozoan trophozoites. Most gram-negative bacteria are next. The fungus and their spores will be next. Non-envelope viruses, then most gram-positives, and then finally the least resistant or the most susceptible to microbial control is going to be those enveloped viruses. So in general, most gram-positive bacteria are easier to kill than most gram-negatives, and that has to do with that outer phospholipid membrane found in the gram-negative cell wall. Protozoan cysts are harder to get rid of than the living state simply because usually the cysts are protected in either a tissue or by a capsule. Now, Staphylococcus is one of the more difficult bacteria to kill, even though it is a gram-positive. And the reason for this is simply because of microbial resistance that has been bred into the Staphylococcus. So, really, when we look at sterilization, we want to look at the bacterial endospores. So these are considered the most resistant of the microbial entities, other than, again, prions, which really are just those protein structures. The destruction of all endospores is the goal of sterilization. Any process that will kill endospores will invariably kill the less resistant microbial forms of life. Other methods of control, such as disinfection or antisepsis, act on microbes that are less hardy than the endospores. So if we just look at the relative resistance here, moist heat will take 120 degrees Celsius to actually get rid of the endospores of most of those organisms that can form them. Whereas the vegetative form or the living cell of those bacteria will be killed at 80 degrees Celsius. Radiation, it takes 4 times the amount of radiation to get rid of the endospores than the vegetative spores. Sterilizing gas such as ethylene oxide is about 1.7 times, endospores are about 1.7 times more resistant. And sporicidal liquids such as 2% glutaraldehyde will actually be the endospores are 18 times more resistant. And what's bad about this is you would have to stay in contact with the organism for a minimum of 3 hours in order to get rid of the endospores. So sterilization is a process that destroys or removes all viable microorganisms, and this would include all the viruses as well. Any material that has been subjected to this process is said to be sterile. Sterilized products are essential to human well-being, such as using surgical instruments, syringes, commercially packaged foods, and the ultimate form of sterilization is truly incineration. Simply burning it beyond recognition, burning it to ash, will destroy all of the proteins. And again, incineration is the only thing that will get rid of the prions. Commercial sterilization is where we use sufficient heat to kill endospores of Clostridium botulinum that would cause botulism in canned foods. Now, disinfection is the use of a physical process or a chemical agent, a disinfectant, to destroy the vegetative pathogens, but disinfection will not get rid of bacterial endospores. Disinfectants are normally only used on inanimate or non-living objects. Antisepsis, the term sepsis literally means the growth of microorganisms in the blood or other tissues. And so if we say a patient is septic, we mean that they have a widespread systemic microbial growth throughout the entire body. Whereas asepsis or antisepsis is any practice that prevents the entry of infectious agents into sterile tissues and prevents infection. Aseptic techniques, these will use sterile methods that exclude all microbes, such as creating a sterile field in a surgical suite. And antisepsis is the application of the chemical agents or antiseptics to exposed body surfaces and surgical incisions to destroy or inhibit vegetative pathogens. So, for example, the use of surgical scrubs or surgical solutions to clean the surgical site before an incision is made is antisepsis. Now, germicide and microbiicides. These are chemical agents that actually kill microorganisms. So depending on what microbe you are targeting, we can use the terms bactericide, fungicide, viricide, or even a sporicide. There will be a few of these antimicrobial agents that are capable of killing or at least inactivating endospores. Microbes are prevented from multiplying, but are typically not killed. Oftentimes they are held in what we call stasis when we talk about static agents. So bacteriostatic agents prevent the growth of bacteria, but do not actually kill them. Fungistatic, same thing with the fungi. And microbiostatic agents simply are chemicals used to control microorganisms, and that includes all of them, in the body. And this would include several of our antiseptics and some of our drugs. Now, sanitation or decontamination. This is any cleansing technique that mechanically removes microbes and debris. So when you use, for example, your dishwasher, you are decontaminating or sanitizing the dishes inside the machine. You are not removing all microbes. You're certainly not killing all microbes. You are simply mechanically removing them to decrease their numbers. So this reduces contaminations to, quote, safe levels. A sanitizer is a soap or detergent used to sanitize, and this could be either on an inanimate or animate surface. Antisepsis and degermination. This really is the reduction of the number of microbes on the skin, and it involves scrubbing the skin or immersing it in chemicals or both. Oftentimes these sanitizers used on the skin will also emulsify the oils in the outer cutaneous layers of the skin, and that will actually help remove the microbes from the surface of the skin. So simply washing your hands with soap and water, which is the absolute best way to prevent the spread of many contagious diseases. So, what are some of the practical concerns in microbial control? Well, we need to ask, does the item in question require sterilization, or is disinfection or even decontamination adequate? Is the item to be reused, or is it a one-time use and permanently discarded? If it will be reused, can the item withstand heat, pressure, radiation, or chemicals? Is the control method suitable for a given application? And will the agent penetrate to the necessary extent to either sterilize or disinfect whatever surfaces we want it to do that job with? And is the method cost and labor efficient, and is it safe? So we can divide medical devices into three primary categories. Critical medical devices are those that are expected to come in contact with, quote, sterile tissue. So basically the inside of the body cavities. So things like your surgical instruments would be critical medical devices. Semi-critical medical devices come into contact with either the skin or mucosal membranes. So something like the colonoscope, the endoscope used for colonoscopies, is actually a semi-critical medical device. Non-critical medical devices are those that do not touch the patient or are only expected to touch intact skin. So things like your bedding. Now, what is microbial death? How do we know when a microbe is dead, especially looking at a bacteria? You can't really tell by looking at a bacteria whether it's living or dead. So it's much harder to detect whether microbes actually are dead. There are no conspicuous vital signs. You can't exactly take their pulse and blood pressure. And lethal agents oftentimes do not alter the overt appearance of these microbial cells. So I can't tell by just looking at bacteria under a microscope if they're truly living or dead. Loss of movement cannot be used to indicate death because some microbes actually don't move anyway. And so we don't know. So there's special qualifications that are needed to define and delineate microbial death. Factors that can affect the death rate is certainly the number of microorganisms. The more organisms, the longer it's going to take to kill all of them. The nature of the microbes in the population. Where do they fit on our resistance table? Are they mycoplasma or mycobacterium, or are they a non-enveloped virus? The type of microbial growth. Is this a bacteria or is this a virus that is in a host cell? What is the temperature and pH of the environment? Because this can actually alter the death rate as well. And what is the concentration of the agent? In the laboratory, we use a 10% hypochlorite solution or 10% bleach. Well, will 50% bleach do a better job? Well, the answer really is no, it won't. And so the 10% bleach solution, why we use that, is because it will actually disinfect everything that we want it to disinfect while not causing any more harmful safety issues that higher concentrations would do. However, if we went down to 5% sodium hypochlorite, then that's not going to be as effective as the 10%. So that's why we use that 10% sodium hypochlorite solution or 10% bleach. What is the mode of action? How does it work on the microbes to actually kill the organisms? And is there presence of solvents, interfering organic matter, or some sort of inhibitors in the environment? So when we look at the death rate over time, and this is actually just simply the log death phase of the growth curve of microbes. So the log number of viable cells, and again, it is a logarithmic death because they die exponentially. So if we look out here at 14 minutes, we have no viable living organisms. So we run our autoclave at 121 degrees Celsius for 15 minutes because we know that the low microbial load that we put in is going to be killed probably by 15 minutes. Also, we look for how many of the organisms we have. If we have 1 billion microorganisms, it's going to take 15 minutes. But if we only have, let's say, 100, then we're going to look at a very low load, and they're going to actually die in quicker time. What about if we have endospores? Well, we've already seen that endospores are harder to kill, and it's going to take a longer time to kill those endospores than the actual living cells. And are we using a microbiostatic agent or a microbiocidal agent? So if we're using a microbiostatic agent, again, the cells are not going to be killed, but if they are simply going to be held in stasis and so they remain in a steady state of a population. Whereas the microbiocidal agent is actually going to kill them. And again, the amount of time it would take would depend upon several factors. So exactly how do antimicrobials work? This is a very important thing. There are actually 4 cellular targets of physical and chemical agents. They can target the cell wall, they can target the cell membrane, they can target cellular synthetic processes, and this includes both DNA replication and protein synthesis, or they can target proteins. And what I'm talking here basically is they target specific enzymes and stop the enzymatic metabolism within the cell. So let's look at those agents that work on the cell wall. 2 ways that agents can work on the cell wall. One, they could break it down completely and break down the peptidoglycan. If we lose the cell wall, the cell is going to lyse. Or it may actually just stop repair of the cell wall, and eventually the cell wall will degrade and again cause lysis of the cell. So we can block cell wall synthesis, or we can actually digest the cell wall itself. Breaking down the surface of the cell wall, and this will then cause the cell to become lysed very easily because, again, of the high osmotic internal pressure of bacteria. Detergents and alcohols will disrupt the cell wall in several different ways, and this will actually primarily include the gram-negatives. The cell membrane and the viral envelope are composed of phospholipids and proteins. And so if we can disrupt the phospholipid membrane, this will cause loss of selective permeability, so we can't move things in or out of the cell. Loss of vital molecules, especially like proteins that may be necessary for, again, transport or as receptors. And this can also allow then the entry of damaging chemicals because of the loss of selective permeability. Surfactants work very well against the cell membranes. Surfactants are polar molecules with hydrophilic and hydrophobic regions, just like the phospholipids have a hydrophobic and a hydrophilic portion. They physically bind to the phospholipid layer and penetrate the internal hydrophobic region of the membranes, thereby disrupting the membrane. This will open up leaky spots that will allow things to seep into the cell and important ions to actually leak out. So this is what it looks like. These surfactant molecules have a hydrophilic head and a hydrophobic tail, very similar to the phospholipids. And they simply then will intersperse in between the phospholipids and simply break up the membrane. Agents that affect protein synthesis and nucleic acid synthesis. Microbial cells depend on an orderly and continuous supply of proteins, and they rely upon being able to replicate their DNA. Substances that inhibit ribosomes, for example, will also then inhibit protein synthesis. Nucleic acids are necessary for the continued function of microbes, and any agent that impedes the transcription of DNA in DNA replication or DNA transcription to messenger RNA will change the genetic code, is therefore antimicrobial. Now, again, proteins in DNA or RNA have what we call a native state. And this is the normal three-dimensional configuration of the protein or nucleic acid that allows proper function. We can denature these proteins and nucleic acids by disrupting their three-dimensional shape and rendering them non-functional. So breaking of the hydrogen bonds that maintain the secondary and tertiary structure or the helical structure of the nucleic acids will cause them to denature and lose function. So what could denature proteins or DNA? Well, certainly moist heat. This causes an irreversible solidification of the protein. And so, for example, when I boil an egg, the egg white goes from a liquid state and clear to being white and solid. We actually are denaturing the albumin protein. Strong organic acids or phenolics can actually denature proteins very easily. Some other effects, metallic ions could actually bind to the active site of enzymes, preventing it from interacting with its substrate by competitive inhibition. So here's our native state, and here would be our substrates at the active sites. And so I could completely denature the protein, just basically taking it back to its primary state of a chain of amino acids, and so the substrate has nowhere to bind. Or I could simply alter the shape of the native state enough so that I no longer have the binding site available for the substrate. Or I could have a competitive inhibitor that will block the substrate from being able to bind. The take-home message is no matter what I do, the active site can no longer accept the substrate and the enzyme is now inactivated and the chemical reactions will not occur. So, blank is the disinfection on a living surface. And put the following in order from most resistant to least resistant. Describe the difference between a bactericidal agent and a bacteriostatic agent. And list and describe 4 factors that affect microbial death rate. And what are the 4 cellular targets of physical and chemical agents within especially bacterial cells? So, under our physical control, we've known for a long time that heat is going to destroy microbes, and so heat is the most widely used method of microbial control. Other methods are radiation and filtration. We can use ultrasonic waves in some cases as well. We could even use cold. While heat is a more effective destroyer of microbes, cold can actually slow down their growth and sometimes even eventually kill the organisms. So, moist heat and dry heat. Moist heat, such as boiling, hot water, steam, especially under pressure, all of these are very effective antimicrobial control agents. Temperatures range anywhere from about 60 degrees Celsius to 135 degrees Celsius. And as I said, our autoclave is set to run at 121 degrees Celsius to get those endospores. We can operate at lower temperatures with moist heat and for shorter exposure times than with dry heat. Most microbicidal effect is coagulation and denaturing of the proteins to permanently halt microbial metabolism. Now, dry heat can be used, but we have to use a much higher temperature and longer exposure time. So what we'll see is air with a low moisture content has to be heated to a higher temperature. We can use this by using a flame or even an electric heating coil. Temperatures have to range usually above 160 degrees Celsius to several thousand degrees Celsius. Lack of water actually increases the stability of some protein configurations, and this is what will necessitate the higher temperatures in order to denature the proteins. At high temperatures, dry heat actually oxidizes or burns the cells, and so this simply burns them to ash eventually. So let's compare moist heat and dry heat. So at 121 degrees Celsius, it takes 15 minutes to sterilize whatever we put in the autoclave. But at 121 degrees Celsius in dry heat, it would take 600 minutes or 10 hours to receive the same amount of sterilization. Even at 170 degrees Celsius of dry heat, it would take an hour to do the same thing that we do at 121 degrees for 15 minutes. So moist heat is more efficient at denaturing proteins and actually stopping microbial growth than is dry heat. Bacterial endospores actually exhibit the greatest resistance of all of the living structures to disinfection methods. The only thing that's worse is going to be the prions. And so destruction of the spore usually requires temperatures above 100 degrees Celsius or boiling. Resistance will vary, however, among the bacterial endospores. Vegetative cells also vary in their sensitivity to heat. Remember, some of the bacteria actually are facultative thermophiles. They can withstand a little bit of heat without actually dying. Both temperature and length of exposure, therefore, should be considered for adequate sterilization. Higher temperatures allow for shorter exposure times. So therefore, lower temperatures are going to require longer exposure times. I could actually use my oven in my kitchen as a sterilizer, but it's going to take a long time to sterilize everything. Now, two terms that you should be familiar with when we talk about using heat. The thermal death time. This is the shortest length of time required to kill all test microbes at a specified temperature. So with thermal death time, the temperature is the fixed variable and time is the variable that we don't know. So I'll choose a temperature and use that temperature and then look how long does it take until I've killed all the target microbes. Thermal death point, now we do just the opposite. What we're going to do is we're going to set the time and then figure out how high we have to go to kill the organisms. So it is the lowest temperature that's required to kill all the microbes in a sample in a 10-minute period. So you have tables in your text that go through the different methods of moist heat control. So certainly boiling water will disinfect the water. We really can't get much higher than about 102 or 3 degrees Celsius with boiling, and so this would be useful for home disinfection of water, material for babies, foods and utensils, or even bedding or clothing from a sick room. Pasteurization actually will disinfect beverages, and there's basically three ways we do pasteurization. Ordinary pasteurization requires specialized heat exchangers that expose the liquid to about 72 degrees Celsius for 15 seconds, which is known as the flash method, or 63 degrees Celsius to 66 degrees Celsius for 30 minutes, and this is known as the batch method. Both of these actually are used to pasteurize milk and other products. However, for milk, certainly, we usually use the batch methods because we are going to be using large amounts, and we don't want to heat the milk up to such a degree that we start denaturing the nutritional proteins within the milk. We then will usually cool all the liquids down, and we may or may not do this a second time. The first method at 72 degrees is preferable because it's less likely to change the flavor and it's more effective against certain resistant pathogens such as Coxiella or Mycobacterium. But although these treatments inactivate most viruses and destroy the vegetative states of probably 97 to 99% of all bacteria and fungi, they do not kill endospores and especially those heat-resistant microbes. Now, there's also an ultra pasteurization process, and this is used with milk, and we will actually heat the milk to 134 degrees Celsius, so way above boiling, for 1 to 2 seconds. This actually will create a milk that is shelf stable at room temperature for several months. If you've ever had this high ultra temperature pasteurized milk, however, it doesn't taste very good because at 134 degrees Celsius, we're going to be breaking down the nutrient proteins, and that's going to change the taste of our product. Steam under pressure using a sterilizer. At sea level, normal atmospheric pressure is 10 pounds per square inch or 1 atmosphere. At this pressure, water will boil or change from liquid to gas at 100 degrees Celsius. And so the resultant steam will remain at that temperature, which is usually too low to kill microbes. So in order to raise the temperature of the steam, pressure at which it is generated must be increased. So as pressure is increased, the temperature at which water boils and the temperature of the steam produced both rise. So for example, at a pressure of 20 pounds per square inch, so 15 pounds per square inch above normal, the temperature of the steam is 109 degrees Celsius. As the pressure is increased to 10 psi above normal, the steam's temperature rises to 115 degrees Celsius, and at 15 psi above normal, then that's a total of 2 atmospheres, it will be 121 degrees Celsius. Our autoclave in the lab is set to run at 15 psi above normal, and this will raise the temperature to 121 degrees Celsius. So it's not the pressure by which it kills microbes, but it's the increased temperature of the steam. And this just simply shows the inside of a steam sterilizer. And these come in various sizes, all the way from small tabletop models such as this one right here, to the one that we have in the laboratory, to extremely large ones used primarily in industrial and hospital settings. Dry heat methods, we actually use the incinerator in the laboratory, and this is where we simply heat a coil to very high temperatures, and in fact the inside of that incinerator can generate temperatures very, very high. The Bunsen burner, which is what I used when I started all of this, can actually get to about 1870 degrees Celsius at its hottest point, right down there in that blue flame. And so this is going to kill pretty much everything. The hot air oven will provide another means of dry heat sterilization. However, we're going to have to go at high temperatures, 150 to 180 degrees Celsius, for longer exposure times, so about 2 to 4 hours to get all of the endospores. Cold treatment typically tends to retard the activity of most microbes. It holds it in stasis. However, if it gets cold enough, some microbes will actually be killed by cold temperatures. Most are not adversely affected by gradual cooling or long-term refrigeration or even deep freezing. Now, desiccation, I said, microbes have to have water in order to grow and reproduce. So if I dehydrate vegetative cells directly exposed to normal room air, they're not going to be able to grow and reproduce. Does that mean they're dead? No. It means that if I add water, then they're going to start growing and reproducing again. Some very delicate pathogens could be killed by desiccation, but this is actually usually fairly rare. Actually, what we can use desiccation for is the preservation of pathogens. So we simply hold them in stasis so that they're not growing or reproducing, but then we can add water into their environment and they will start reproducing again. Desiccation, therefore, can preserve foods. If we remove the water, the microbes can't grow and reproduce. Lyophilization is actually a combination of freezing and drying. So it's actually going to be a freeze-dried product that we get. This is a common method of preserving microbes for long periods in other cells in a viable state. Pure cultures are actually frozen instantaneously in either liquid nitrogen or liquid CO2. This will then not allow water to expand within the cell, disrupting any membranes or cell walls. And then we take that frozen chunk and actually expose it to vacuum that sublimates the water. Sublimation is where the water goes from from a frozen to a gaseous state without passing through the liquid state. And what we wind up with is a little pellet of freeze-dried material. Radiation, energy emitted through atomic activities and dispersed at high velocity through matters or space, will actually disrupt DNA and RNA structures. So radiation suitable for microbial control includes gamma rays, which can be very deadly to living tissues, so we're going to use this primarily only on inanimate objects, and things such as plastics that cannot stand heating and steam sterilization would be a good example for something we want to use gamma rays for. We could use X-rays or even ultraviolet radiation. Now again, going back to our electromagnetic spectrum, The higher the frequency of waves, the more likely it is to pass through living tissue and cause damage to the DNA. So gamma rays are the highest frequency waves, X-rays are next, and the ultraviolet light is the next one in line. So ionizing versus non-ionizing radiation. The higher frequency waves of gamma and X-rays are going to be ionizing, and UV, depending where we are on the spectrum of UV, can either be ionizing at the higher frequency or non-ionizing at the lower frequency. Irradiation is the bombardment of a substance with radiation. Ionizing radiation, the radiation ejects orbital electrons from an atom, causing ions to form. And when those electrons come flying off of that atom, they create high frequency energy waves. This can cause the most damage to proteins and nucleic acids. Non-ionizing radiation, however, simply excites atoms, raising the outermost electrons into higher energy orbitals. This then creates a faster running electron around the atom, and this can then cause damage again to cell membranes, proteins, or sometimes nucleic acids. This can oftentimes lead to the formation of abnormal bonds within the molecules of DNA, and we'll talk about that here in a moment. Now, we oftentimes refer to ionizing radiation as cold sterilization, but this doesn't really have anything to do with temperature. It's just simply the fact that we're not using heat. Ionizing radiation is used as an effective alternative to heat for sterilizing materials that are heat sensitive. So this can be used for things like plastics or other things that are very sensitive to heat or to other chemicals. So irradiation is one type, and this is actually usually used to actually sterilize or to at least decontaminate food stuff. And several years back, and you can still find this symbol occasionally, but several years back, all foods that were irradiated carried this symbol. And what this meant is they had been exposed to ionizing radiation at some point to kill the microbes. Now, a lot of people have a problem with that because they think, oh, I'm eating radiation. You're not. The electrons are long gone, but it killed the microbes. Now, could it affect the DNA within the foodstuff? That is a possibility. Non-ionizing radiation in UV, the UV spectrum itself ranges from 100 nanometers on the highest frequency end to 400 nanometers just outside that visible spectrum of light. The most lethal range of UV light to microbes is somewhere between 240 to 280 nanometers. And so the peak is at about 260 nanometers of wave frequency. Germicidal lamps tend to generate about 254 nanometers frequency of UV light. It's not as penetrating as ionizing radiation, but it oftentimes will do a good job of decontaminating surfaces. UV light passes readily through air, slightly through liquids, but only very poorly through solid materials. The object to be disinfected must also be in direct contact or exposure for the full effect to take place with UV light. The effects of UV radiation is initially absorbed by DNA molecules, where this will then form sometimes something known as pyrimidine or thymine dimers. These are abnormal linkages between adjacent pyrimidines, either thymine or cytosine. So if I have two thymine next door to each other on one side of the DNA, they can actually unlink from their adenines on the other side and cross-link with each other. This causes a change in the shape of the DNA and will interfere with normal DNA replication and transcription. And this can lead to then inhibition of the organism or even to death. So here's what this does. So here I have two thymins next to each other on this one side. The ultraviolet light will cause them to again unlink from their adenines and form a double cross bond between each other. And this is the thymine or pyrimidine dimer. Cytosine will sometimes do this, but it's not really as effective as thymine for doing this. We do have enzymes, however, that can come along and actually clip out these abnormal thymine dimers and then put in regular thymine nucleotides to attach again to the adenine. But if we don't catch these thymine dimers, they can actually cause bending of this site of the DNA, and that can cause abnormal reading patterns or simply not being able to read the DNA at all. Now, filtration is really a physical method. It's an effective method to remove most microbes from air and liquids. The fluid is strained through a filter with openings large enough for the liquid to pass through, but too small for microbes to pass through. And the filtrate that is collected then will be said to be sterile. Most filters are perforated by precise, uniform-sized pores. We have coarse filters that have holes about 8 microns in diameter, and we go all the way down to ultrafine, which have holes about 0.02 microns in diameter. The ultrafine will allow water to go through because water is smaller than this, but it will actually exclude even most of the viruses because 0.02 is 20 nanometers. We always select our filter to trap the minimum particle size that we want to take out of our solution. Even smaller pore diameters permit true sterilization by removing the viruses and even some of the large proteins, but not the water. So this just simply shows we have pores in these filters, and these pores are too small to allow these microbes through. Now, the water would take a long time to go through these very small openings, even under the influence of just gravity feed. So most of the time we actually use a vacuum pump that will kind of force the water through these pores at a quicker rate. And this actually shows a filter here with these very small openings, and here's some Staphylococcus. And these are about 1 micron wide, and so you can see these are very, very small openings, and just by size, these will be excluded on the filter. So we can use filtration for liquids that cannot withstand heat. It's an alternative method for decontaminating milk and beer, and it's an important step in water purification systems. It is also an effective means of removing most airborne contaminants. However, I will say that some of even the HEPA filters, as good as they are, typically will not remove even small viruses. And so when we think about our masks that we're needing to wear, the masks actually have to be of a small enough pore to exclude the small coronavirus. That's why many of the masks actually are not effective. Now, osmotic pressure. Adding large amounts of salt or sugar or some other solute to foods create a hypertonic environment to the microbes. This means that they will then lose water and actually cause plasmolysis of the cell membrane as it shrinks away from the cell wall, in effect killing the spoilage bacteria. This makes it impossible then for the microbes to grow and multiply. And without salted pork or sugared hams, we would not have actually gone across the country in the Conestoga wagons. Now, needless to say, you have to add fairly large amounts of salt or sugar in order to do this. Cured meats are treated with high salt concentrations so they can be kept for long periods without refrigeration. And this is the way we actually stored most meat before the advent of refrigeration. High sugar in jams and jelly actually has the same effect, and so therefore you get very few spoilage microbes that can grow in those jams or jellies because of the high sugar content. Plus the fact just makes them taste good. So, true or false, lower temperatures can be used with dry heat than with moist heat. The lowest temperature required to kill all of the microbes in a sample in a 10-minute period is called the what? True or false, cold merely retards the growth of most microbes. And true or false, filtration is not a method of sterilization. And ultraviolet radiation produces what type of dimers? Okay, so let's look at some of these chemical agents. Antimicrobial chemicals can again be solid, liquid, or gaseous, but again, most solids will be dissolved in a solution and so will be in a liquid state. And it's just simply for convenience that oftentimes the solid or even the gaseous antimicrobials will be dissolved in water, alcohol, or a mixture of the two. Aqueous solutions are solutions that contain pure water as the solvent, whereas tinctures are antimicrobial chemicals dissolved in either pure alcohol or water alcohol mixtures. And probably some of you have heard of tincture of iodine. The iodine is actually dissolved in a water alcohol mixture. So this is a table just looking at some of these, and we're going to look at some of these in a little bit more detail in just a moment. But what I wanted to point out about this chart is that it does look at the target microbes of each of these agents and whether the level of activity is intermediate, low, or high. And is there any toxicity issues that may come along with these products to living tissues or humans? And any other comments about them as well. So you can go through this chart in your text and take a look at each of these, but we're going to look at some of these in a little more detail. So how do I select a microbial chemical? What are the desirable qualities that I want to see? Well, I'd like rapid action in low concentrations that are not toxic. I'd like them to be very soluble in water or alcohol and have long-term stability when they are dissolved in their solutions. I'd like them to be very broad spectrum in their microbiocidal action without causing toxicity to human or animal tissues. I would like them to penetrate inanimate surfaces to sustain a cumulative or persistent action. I would like them resistant to becoming inactivated by organic matter that could be found in the environment. I'd like them to be non-corrosive to the surfaces or non-staining. And I'd like them to be sanitizing and deodorizing. In other words, I'd like for them to not stink up the entire place. And a big question is affordability and readily available. High-level germicides kill endospores. They're sterilants if they are used properly. Critical items that are not heat sterilizable can actually use these high-level germicides as a sterilant. These things would include things like IV or urinary catheters, heart-lung equipment, and certain internal implants. Intermediate level germicides kill fungal spores but not bacterial spores, or resistant pathogens such as the mycobacterium or some of the enveloped viruses even. They are used to disinfect semi-critical items such as respiratory equipment, such as your respirators, thermometers, etc. Low-level germicides eliminate only the vegetative bacteria or vegetative fungal spores. They can actually eliminate some viruses, most of them enveloped, and they typically are used to clean non-critical materials such as electrodes of the EEG or EKG machines, straps that are used, etc. even furniture that touches skin but not mucosal membrane. So things like chair seats or bed railings. We have to also consider several things when choosing our antimicrobial chemical. One, we want to look at the nature of the microorganisms being treated. We want to look at the nature of the material being treated. If I can heat sterilize it, that's going to be great, but I can't always do that. The degree of contamination, how many microbes are there, and how long will it take? How long do I need to leave this chemical in contact with this surface in order to get the desired effect? So how long is it going to take me? And the strength and chemical action of the germicide. Where is it working in or on the cell? And what is the max or minimum strength that I can use to get my desired effect? Modes of action, again, of the germicides will be, again, the proteins, primarily enzymes, the nucleic acids, and this would include both DNA synthesis and protein synthesis, the cell wall, and the cell membrane. So let's look at some of these. The halogens. This includes fluorine, bromine, chlorine, and iodine. These are all microbicidal and endosporicidal. These are active ingredients in almost a third of all antimicrobial chemicals available. Gaseous chlorine, chlorine gas, Cl2. Hypochlorites, such as our bleach solution. The chloramines. All of these will kill bacteria, endospores, fungi, and virus. And this is one of the reasons that we use our 10% bleach solution in the laboratory. They are less effective if exposed to light, alkaline pHs, or excessive organic matter. So again, we want to look at our environment and see, do we have blood, vomit, diarrhea, whatever in the environment, or do we have something that is causing an alkaline pH? We refill your 10% hypochlorite solution bottles frequently because over time, even fluorescent light can actually make the bleach less efficient. The hypochlorites are broadly used in industry and allied health, as household bleach is a weak solution of actually sodium hypochlorite. So even what you buy is not full strength bleach. The chloramines are used as alternatives to pure chlorine, especially in water treatment. Iodine has been around for a long time, and free iodine, I2, is one of the things that we use. We can also use iodophores of iodine, and all classes of iodine iodophores will kill if proper concentrations and exposure times are used. Typically, these iodine iodophores are not adversely affected by the presence of organic matter. Aqueous iodine is used as a topical antiseptic and usually treatment for burned skin. Iodine tincture in the alcohol or alcohol water usually is used in skin antisepsis. And so this is actually what betadine is a tincture of iodine. Iodine tablets have often been used for disinfecting waters, and especially individuals who go out camping or hiking and may wind up not having fresh water, they actually usually take some iodine tablets with them that they can put in a pot of water to help decrease the amount of microbes in that water. The iodophores are a complex of iodine and alcohol, and they have replaced free iodine solutions primarily in medical antisepsis. Now, phenol. Phenol was one of the first major chemicals used as an antimicrobial agent, but it has some major drawbacks. First of all, it was toxic to living organisms and had very irritating side effects. It also smells horrible. It smells like rotten eggs. So, we actually chemically manipulated phenol to create some of the phenolics that we still use. These will destroy vegetative bacteria, fungi, and even some of the virus, but they're not very effective on endospores. They are able to act in the presence of organic matter. but they're too toxic to use as antiseptics, so we use these as disinfectants only. Phenol is actually an aromatic ring structure, and again, it really reeks. If you've ever smelled creosote that they use to soak the utility poles or railroad ties, that is actually a phenolic, and that's why it has that very weird smell. It's actually either O-creosol or P-creosol, and it's both are the same except where this CH3 group is located on the ring. A bisphenol is one of the phenolics, and hexachlorophene is one of the more common ones that we see used today. So the creosols, phenolic derivatives are often combined with soaps, especially in your bar soaps. Bisphenols are aerosol sprays and cleaning soaps. And here's a big one, triclosan. Triclosan is a major disinfectant and antiseptic chemical added to many, many products still today. And we'll talk a little bit more about triclosan here in a little bit. Chlorhexidine is another phenolic that is commonly used in medical areas for hand scrubbing, surgical prep, or even for disinfecting and decontaminating surgical instruments. Now, alcohols have also been used as antimicrobial agents, but only ethanol and isopropanol, or ethyl and isopropyl alcohol, are appropriate for microbial control. Their greater efficacy if they are mixed with water at somewhere between 70 to 95% alcohol to water. Alcohols will destroy the vegetative microbial forms, but again are not endosporicides. They're most effective against the enveloped viruses versus non-enveloped viruses. The alcohol actually will cause the outer phospholipid envelope of both gram-negative bacteria and the envelope viruses to actually dehydrate. So ethyl alcohol is actually available in 70 to 95% solution. It is often used for skin degerming and disinfection of some types of medical equipment. However, the evaporation of both alcohols actually limit the effectiveness. Isopropyl alcohol is more microbicidal and less expensive than ethanol, but again, the evaporation rate limits its effectiveness. And vapors of isopropyl alcohol can adversely affect the nervous system when inhaled over long periods of time. Now, hydrogen peroxide. Hydrogen peroxide has germicidal effects due to the production of toxic reactive oxygens. So it's bactericidal, virucidal, fungicidal, and even sporicidal at very high concentrations. Hydrogen peroxide can be used as an antiseptic in skin and wound cleaning, bedsore care, even in mouthwashes. However, I will mention hydrogen peroxide actually slows healing. So I only use hydrogen peroxide as an antiseptic if I'm cleaning out a very dirty wound, one that's got a lot of debris in it. It can be used as a disinfectant, and oftentimes in your contact solutions, especially soft contacts, we'll see a little hydrogen peroxide, or surgical implants or plastic equipment, etc., that cannot withstand the high heat of sterilization. And it can even be used for sterilization in high amounts for delicate reusable items. But it has some drawbacks. One, decreases healing. And vaporized hydrogen peroxide is actually toxic, and so this is only used for small industrial items or larger items enclosed in spaces. Ozone, O3, actually is a derivative hydrogen peroxide and has been used to have similar effects as hydrogen peroxide. Now, surfactants, the detergents, very limited microbiocidal power. Their activity is due to the amphipathic nature of the molecule, the fact that they have both a hydrophilic and hydrophobic portion. So varied effects occur. Activity is reduced by the presence of organic matter. And this is actually just a couple of our chemical detergents. So this is actually benzocalinum chloride, which is a common uh, detergent or surfactant found in many of your hand washing soaps, dishwashing soaps, etc. The quaternary ammonium compounds, or the quats, these also are found in many of our detergents and soaps. It is a disinfectant. It's usually mixed with other cleaning agents to sanitize a variety of objects and surfaces. It's found as a preservative for most ophthalmological solutions and even certain cosmetics. In soaps, they are very weak microbiocides. And in fact, Pseudomonas has actually been shown to grow abundantly in soap dishes where the quaternary ammonia compounds were found. It's mainly used as a mechanical removal of microbes. It's more germicidal when combined with either chlorhexidine or iodine. So this is just a chart showing the non-germicidal soap and germicidal soaps. And you'll see that germicidal soaps over a period of 4 days, yes, will decrease the numbers, while non-germicidal soaps have basically no effect whatsoever. Now, certain heavy metals actually have antimicrobial properties, such as copper, silver, and mercury. These are oligodynamic, meaning that they're toxic in very minute quantities. Only mercury and silver have been used as significant as germicides in the last, say, 100 years. The drawbacks is oftentimes these are toxic to humans if ingested. They can cause allergic reactions, and they oftentimes are neutralized by biological waste products. Microbes can develop resistance to these heavy metals just like they can with any other chemical that's used against them. Weak organic mercury tinctures are effective antiseptics and typically stop infective agents, so they are infection preventions. They oftentimes are found as preservatives in cosmetics and ophthalmic solutions, as well as certain vaccines. Silver compounds are primarily used more than mercury because of the toxic nature of mercury. Silver nitrate is a topical germicide. Silver sulfadiazine. This is a very important antimicrobial. It's silver mixed with one of the sulfa drugs, and it works really well against Pseudomonas in burn therapy. And so burn treatment, oftentimes we're using silver sulfadiazine to work against the Pseudomonas infections that we oftentimes will see. Pure silver is actually incorporated into the lining of catheters, especially IV catheters. And colloidal silver is actually used as a mild germicide. We actually now are seeing some fabrics that actually incorporate silver into the fabric itself to actually be antimicrobial. So silver ions are what's usually incorporated into these hard surfaces or textiles. Now, the aldehydes. This group of organic chemicals are very toxic to living tissues. So there's only a few of them that have been actually used as antimicrobials, and always as disinfectants only. Glutaraldehyde is very rapid in its antimicrobial work, it's broad spectrum, and has even been accepted as a sterilant in high concentrations. It remains potent in the presence of organic matter. However, we have to have long contact time with the surface in order to have the germicidal effects. Formaldehyde. This one you may be a little more familiar with. 10% formaldehyde is what we know as formalin, and this is an aqueous solution. Formalin has been used to preserve living tissues for eons. It's an intermediate to high-level disinfectant, but it is extremely toxic because it kills and hardens living tissue. Orthophthaledehyde, or OPA, is similar to glutaraldehyde in its effects, but it typically tends to be less irritating. It, however, does not destroy endospores as glutaraldehyde would do if they had a long enough exposure time. So glutaraldehyde sterilizes materials damaged by heat, but there are other methods, and so typically we don't use glutaraldehyde very often. Formalin tincture disinfects surgical instruments and are used oftentimes in aquaculture. And this is the actual active ingredient in embalming fluid. Now, gaseous sterilants, ethylene oxide is probably the most common gas that's used as a sterilant. We have to use a specialized structure known as the chemiclave for ethylene oxide sterilization. Ethylene oxide is explosive and it's very toxic, especially to the lung, eyes, and mucous membranes. And so the chemiclave actually will collect the used ethylene oxide and return it to storage where it does not become irritating. Propylene oxide is less toxic than ethylene oxide, and so it is oftentimes used in the sterilization of foods. Chlorine dioxide is used primarily for water treatments as a gas sterilant. And this was also used to disinfect the halls of Congress after the anthrax attacks in 2001. Now, acids and alkalis can also be used. Aqueous ammonium oxide. This is an alkaline substance that's found in many detergents, cleaners, and deodorizers. Certain organic acids can be used, especially in food preservation. Things like acetic acid, which is basically vinegar used in pickling, propionic acid, lactic acid, benzoic acid, and ascorbic or scorbic acid. And what this is vitamin C. Now, let's talk about triclosan, one of those phenolics. It is estimated that 75% of all Americans secrete on a daily basis a measurable amount of triclosan in their urine. It's in detectable levels in groundwater sources, and it creates dioxin-like compounds when exposed to sunlight. It promotes resistance to triclosan and even other antibiotics as well. But it has been found in many, many, many products, such as, again, some of the sanitizing, disinfectant wipes, some of our mildew cleaners, antibacterial hand soaps, and this includes both bars and liquid forms. Okay. And even triclosan has been found in toothpastes. Now, most of the toothpaste companies have now taken triclosan out of their products. And that probably is a good thing, since most of us brush our teeth every day. So, concept check. Describe 4 desirable qualities of a germicide. Describe 3 factors that affect the action of germicides. The most extensively used of all chlorine compounds is what? True or false, phenol is still extensively used as a disinfectant. True or false, a higher concentration of alcohol is more effective than a lower concentration. And list 2 acids used in food preservations. So that's chapter 11. So we'll see you next time for chapter 12.